Welcome, everyone. I'm Fiona Conway, President of the RTDNA Canada, and welcome to what we hope will be the first of many webinars where we will seek to get to the heart of issues and the challenges facing journalism today. We are in a period of major change in how we practice journalism, and yes, sometimes change can be good. And it is our goal through these kind of discussions that we can learn and understand and thrive in our current realities and the challenges that are no doubt still to come. Our first topic today is a reality of our past, our present, and our future, the questions of journalistic objectivity, inclusion, and BIPOC journalists. Our moderator is Beatrice Politi, former reporter and now network manager at Global News. Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you to our panel. Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And to discuss this issue today we are joined by three outstanding journalists, and you can see them there on your screen. Tamika Forrester at CBC News. Tamika is a digital producer with CBC News and the lead producer behind CBC's Being Black in Canada project. She's nearly 20 years experience working as a journalist in both Canada and Jamaica. Farah Nasser, my colleague at Global News, one of Toronto's most recognizable faces in news. Farah Nasser is an award-winning journalist, bringing extensive experience to her role as an anchor on Global News at 5:30 and 6. And one of her most recent projects was covering the election in the United States, which we all know from watching was quite a long process. Karyn Pugliese, our third panelist, is an award-winning broadcast journalist and communications specialist. Karyn is the former executive director of news and current affairs at the Aboriginal People's Television Network, APTN. She now teaches journalism at Ryerson University, which happens to be my alma mater. I'm going to introduce the topic here. So the notion of journalistic objectivity underpins the sort of traditional understanding of how to do journalism. We as journalists are trained to think that we can be impartial observers of the truth, but what truth is it that we're reflecting? Whose truth are we reflecting? What underpinnings are we reflecting? And how is this notion of objectivity, this sense of impartial observation, acting as a potential barrier to entry for journalists of color? The events following the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police have laid bare the ways in which the notion of journalistic objectivity needs to be updated. Further, the lines between advocacy, opinion, and news reporting are blurring. So how do we move away from standards or notions that can be exclusionary, that can exclude so many of us who are passionate about journalism? How do we move from a reflection of white privilege to one which also reflects the lived experiences of BIPOC journalists? And this is what we plan to discuss over the course of this RTDNA webinar. So the first question is, what is journalistic objectivity? Are there various understandings of it, for example, generational? I'm going to start with Farah Nasser. Please go ahead, Farah.
Thanks, Beatrice, and hello, everyone. I think, you ended on saying generational, and I think there is a real part of that, right? I think there's really a generation of journalists who are concerned about what's happening right now when things are bleeding into kind of objectivity. But I think there's also the thought that some see what's happening now as journalistic advocacy, and some of the journalists who are, advocating, they see it as the truth, right? There are some communities that see what's happening as the truth. Christiane Amanpour coined this term or this phrase that really sticks with my head, and in my head it's truthful, not neutral. I mean, we're obviously people first before we're journalists, so the idea of being completely neutral is impossible. Nobody is, no matter what they say. But I think that the truth is what's important. Now, I know Karyn, Tamika, and I have been kind of working on what's now seen as kind of a reckoning, a racial reckoning, way before this happened, way before 2020. And some of the work I know I did was seen originally as advocacy journalism. And now it's stuff that's covered in the mainstream, right? So I think that we really have to, news leaders have to really see people's lived experience as representative of certain communities, right? I'll give you an example. We did on Living in Color. I have a web series with Ali Wilson from Global, and it's called Living in Color. And we did a episode on hockey. on discrimination and whiteness in hockey, is what Ali called it. And we had so much hate mail. We had so many people who were saying, oh, how are you pointing this out? Why are you saying this? Just like I think Jess Allen did on the social. Like, so I think this was a couple of years ago, or last year, or no, 2 years ago. And I think this year, we saw people talking about that kind of in mainstream conversation, right? So things have really shifted, but I think that there is a concern when it's kind of not truthful, when it's more opinion. But when there are facts, when there's data to back up what we've seen, how unfair COVID has been to racialized communities, how it's treated, people of color, unemployment, things like that. So I think there are facts to back these types of things up, as there was in hockey when we looked at the number of hockey players, for example, right? But some people have their backup and think that it's advocacy. And I think we have to look at things a little bit differently now.
Thank you, Farah. Over to you, Tamika. Has this definition of journalistic objectivity shifted over time? Does it still need to do a great deal of shifting?
I mean, when I think about objectivity, I immediately go back to J School of those many years ago. I can just hear my professor saying, it's the 5 whys: the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. So it's the 5 W's rather. And, they always say to you, be neutral, yet investigative, be disengaged, but have an impact, be fair-minded, but have an edge. So really, we've been sort of taught to keep our emotions out of it, to sort of let the journalism do the work for us, let our analysis come to the forefront. And is there a place for it? A lot of people will still argue, yes, it's our job as journalists to be fair-minded, to present the information in such a way that the audience can make their own decisions. But, again, I'm coming back to what Farah just said. Where is the room for lived experiences? As journalists, we're humans too. Where is the room for lived experiences? And when we talk about truth, whose truth are we representing? Are we ensuring that we're presenting that balanced perspective to the audience? And these are all important things that us as journalists in this generation, we really have to pay more attention to. And when we talk, have I seen a shift in this definition over time? I think when I look at the stories that I am seeing more often in the newsroom, like, a couple of years ago, if I were to pitch a story on carding, they're like, oh yeah, it's carding again, it's racial profiling. Like I would really have to give a solid reason why this is a problem. If there's a missing person that's a person of color, does it get the same amount of treatment and attention, if it were a white child that was missing? Now, I can be honest and say, since that reckoning with George Floyd, I am beginning to see, a bit more of openness to tackle these stories, to give these stories, more amplification, because they are just as worthy as the other stories that we cover.
Thank you, Tamika. I wanted to pick up on a point that you made about truth, like whose truth are we talking about? And I wanted to pose that question to you, Karyn. What about that notion of truth and whose truth and objectivity?
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole reason why an APTN came into being. I think what happens is when we talk about objectivity, I mean, we know that as people, we're not objective. We're looking for a process that can be objective, that can be fair, that can be balanced. But through this process, what we're calling objectivity actually has a white male boomer bias in it, because the lived experience of most of the people who are making the decisions on story selection, as Tamika said, carding, is that a racial issue or is that a human rights issue? Why would that not be of interest to me and to everybody in Canada if it's a human rights issue? But it gets seen as a racial issue. She talked about missing people. That was a huge one for the Indigenous community. Originally, when women went missing in our community, it was covered from that biased point of view that is seen or understood to be objective. So it's somebody imagining, it's a white male boomer imagining that the audience are a bunch of people like themselves. And when they reported on missing Indigenous women, it was, wow, a crime happened there to someone who's not of our community. And we should do whatever we could to keep our community rent away till the police can clean up the problem. There's been studies done of the coverage, and there was one by Kirsten Gilchrist that was really good, where she looked at white women and Native women who went missing, both of the same class, both girl next door types. And the white women would get headlines like, "Alice, we miss you," and a full biography with a large picture. The Native woman would have Native girl missing, described as nice, no picture, below the full 5th page, you know? So in the story selection, when BIPOC people have been pitching stories, their stories don't get heard or seen as important because they're representing a community that is the other. It's not so much a question of objectivity, but that we think we're being objective and we're actually not.
Thank you, Karyn. I want to remind the people watching this panel that have joined us that please feel free to put forward your questions. There's a little Q&A button, should be on the bottom of your screen where you can submit any questions that you'd like to ask. I wanted to pick up on that notion of stories that BIPOC journalists may have been the ones for many years trying to pitch, so to speak, and how do we handle that in newsrooms today? Because we need to figure out how do we change this thing practically in a way that newsrooms have their own particular workflow, so to speak. So what does the evolution sort of objectivity look like in a newsroom? I'm going to start with you, Tamika, on this one.
I think, I think when we talk about change and where we need to see change, one of the things that, comes to the forefront of my mind is that a lot of the times we have this thing that we only talk to BIPOC people or diverse people when we're talking about diverse issues. And I think that needs to change. Like, we don't only go to a Black person, a person of color, when we're talking about GAM, or when we're talking about carding, or when we're talking about, whatever issue that we think is dominant in the Black community. We shouldn't only just go to, when we're talking about missing and murdered women, we shouldn't just, go to Indigenous people for their view. I think we need to broaden this out. I think we need to be able to see representatives from the different aspects of our community on all issues. If we're talking about real estate, why not have a Black business owner? Why not have a BIPOC person who owns a house? Like, it's not just going to these people for the token topic on diverse conversations. I believe that we need to be able to see, professors, we need to be able to see political analysts, we need to be able to see people from all walks of life, doctors, everything. These people need to be included in the general conversation that we're putting on the air and on our airwaves every single day. That little boy at home, that little girl at home, they need to be able to see their representation. They need to be able to see themselves and say, okay, wow, when I grow up, I can be like this person. Is that a Black architect? Is that a Black CEO? You know what I mean? Like, that's how we begin to see that shift. Yes, it's important to have BIPOC people speak on BIPOC conversation and BIPOC issues, but let's get them more into the day-to-day topics, the news. Let's, begin to see the diversity filter into everyday topics that we have on our airwaves and online.
Thank you, Tamika. I'm going to go to Farah now. How do you feel that this notion of objectivity can change within newsrooms? How should this happen?
Look, I think at the end of the day, I don't think change is really going to happen until there's change at the top in all organizations, management, having, people of color in management positions. I know that's going to take time. And I know there's a lot of organizations are mentoring younger leaders or people to get there, to get to those positions. So that'll take time. But in the meantime, I think it's important for news leadership to really value opinions of people that you normally wouldn't, editorial assistants, interns, people whose perspective and again life experience will give a very different view of newsrooms. I mean, I've worked for people in management positions who have very similar life views and have very similar upbringings and experiences. And, something came to mind that, when I started at Global, it was, we had the death of Gord Downey. And one of the lines in one of the scripts was, who hasn't sat, on a deck at a cottage listening to the Tragically Hip? Like, it's a very Canadian thing to do. And in my mind, I thought, I haven't, and I never had a cottage growing up, and people in Rexdale have probably, some of them haven't heard of the Tragically Hip, so it's like, it's such a simple thing, but it's something, again, it comes down to the writers, the leadership, like everyone kind of doesn't see that other perspective. And I think that perspective is so key right now. So yes, Tamika, it's about getting these experts. It's about getting voices. It's about getting people who we normally don't put on air. And there's organizations, by the way, doing this. So if you're listening, I think it's called Informed Opinions. There's an organization that's just trying to get out, epidemiologists who are women of color and things like that to try to give us more perspective. So that's happening. But I think within the newsrooms, in these editorial meetings, don't just listen to the people who are there. Get the opinions of people you normally wouldn't, even if it's a graphics artist, right? We need to get a variety of opinions to give the news in a proper way. And that Gord Downey example is just a tiny example, just to illustrate to you how we've always done things. We've always said, on the whole long weekend, or going up to the cottage, up the 400, we say that in Toronto. Well, not everybody has a cottage. And sometimes things that you think are very Canadian are not Canadian. And people feel excluded because they don't have these similar experiences that a white Canadian would have. And I think we have to really look at things that way, and especially when it comes to story pitches.
Thank you, Farah. I'll just share that I too don't really think I ever sat out on a deck and listened to Gord Downey. But listen, I've listened to a lot of other Canadian bands. That just wasn't my preference at the time. Karyn, what are your thoughts on this? And I'll add a little bit to it as well. When it comes to covering stories, for example, that may be about BIPOC communities, or that may be a pitch that affects BIPOC communities, how should newsrooms go about covering those stories and assigning those stories, so to speak? Who should be doing those stories? Should those stories be done by journalists themselves who are BIPOC, or should we have anybody covering any story and simply being rooted in the notion that all the stories are worthy? Should we not just be trying to have all our journalists be more culturally, societally, etc. aware? What do you think?
Well, it's a difficult question. Like, there's a few things. You may hire a BIPOC person, and that person may, either Indigenous people who want to cover Indigenous communities. There's some that just want to cover sports. You can't assume that somebody wants to do a certain kind of journalism. I don't have a problem. I mean, hopefully you have a diverse enough newsroom that you have a mixture of people that you can send out. Diversity is always good. APTN, 25% of the reporters are not Indigenous. And very often they would see things in stories from their life experience that was different from what we would see in a story. Sometimes they found stories, it was just things that we were really used to. One of our hosts got floor walked, followed around by a security guard and accused of stealing when he hadn't done anything, simply because of his appearance. And we all thought, sorry that happened. And somebody said, it's a story. The face of your news network just got floor walked. Don't you think that's a story? And we couldn't see it. I think also we always had a certain accountability back to our community. And I write now for the National Observer. So I'm writing for predominantly what I imagine to be a non-native audience, but I still think of that accountability back to my community. They don't have to like what I write, but they have to think that it's at least true. It has to sound authentic to them. The stories that we did at APTN were not all nice stories. We did some real accountability stories on our leadership, but they were balanced, they were fair, and they were true. So I think, like when you're going out and you're covering a community, there's a certain amount of accountability back to that community, that what you're describing sounds authentic and sounds right. It doesn't have to be a story that always shows them in a positive light, but it does have to be true. Where you get into trouble is when you're mischaracterizing the community.
One of the things I wanted to take one of the questions that was sent in by one of the folks watching this panel, and it does have to do with objectivity. I started this off by asking, part of the question was, is objectivity generational? So I was in journalism school 20 years ago, so the curriculum is probably a little bit different. I think the basics of journalism are probably the same, but the situation and even how we do things has changed. So obviously curriculum has changed. So the question offered is, a lot of what we've talked about is doing good journalism, but how is the notion of objectivity being taught in journalism schools, or do you have thoughts on how things should be taught to a new generation of journalists? I'm going to start with you, Karyn, on this one.
Yeah, actually, I did teach that. We have a journalism class.
There you go.
So we did some, and actually, Beatrice, I'll just say, you were in journalism school 20 years ago. So was I. I didn't realize that there was another 4-year-old in journalism school.
That's right. Thank you.
So I mean, the way that I'm teaching people to think about objectivity, and really, it's something that I have to question every time I teach it. Like, am I sure I still believe this? Do I have questions? 20 years ago, we were taught that everybody's biased. We all come from places. The most we can do is be balanced and fair. And I think that's where I settled on it, is that objectivity is a process. It is not a person. It's a process that you go through to try to do your best to be fair, to include other points of view, and to get at the truth.
Thank you. Over to you, Farah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to not understanding two groups in our society, and that's Black and Indigenous people. And I think that we really need to have two separate courses that talk about the history, the trauma, the perspective, what brought us to this position we're in now. I also think there needs to be an extra course on trauma-informed reporting, because there's a lot of reporters who cover these stories and don't understand the nuance because they don't come from these communities, and maybe they're not people of color, and that's understandable, but they need to learn what it's like. Why is there vaccine hesitancy right now within BIPOC communities? Why is that? Are we blaming them? No, it's because there's a mistrust, a long history of mistrust with medical professionals. That's why it's happening. So I think there has to be, we need to understand the trauma that these communities have gone through. We need to understand the historical perspective of these communities to really be able to approach, everyday news that really comes at us in a fair way. So that's what I would add. I don't know what's being taught right now because I don't teach, but I think those are really important courses.
And Tamika, what are your thoughts on that, on how to basically teach objectivity again, so to speak, whether it's in journalism schools or to people like us who've been out of it for a very long time?
I think I've really been out of it for a very long time. But for me, one of the things that I'm coming at that sort of stands out for me is when we talk about truth. When we talk about truth, we have to be mindful that sometimes we aren't getting the full picture when we talk to our subjects, and immediately the story that I cannot get over is the story about the doctor in New Brunswick. There was a big press conference, the premier was there, and we were right in the midst of realizing the seriousness of COVID, and all journalists were told they are aware and they know who caused this outbreak in New Brunswick, and that it all stemmed back to a particular doctor. And I mean, we're hearing it from the premier. We're like, okay, we're sort of like going with it because this is coming from an official. The official must have all the facts, and we're going to take it and we're going to run with it to the audience. But then looking back in hindsight, and of course they always say hindsight is 20/20, when it did come out that this particular doctor that they were talking about is a Black doctor, and oh my gosh, the storm that happened after, like the doctor almost felt targeted. He felt almost like his career was ruined until some of his colleagues sort of rallied around him to sort of stem and staunch all the hate that he was getting. And just looking back, I'm thinking, we as journalists, we really need to challenge the truth, the notion of the truth. Whose truth is it? And we should have pressed the officials just a little bit more. How confident are you that this is the person that caused the outbreak? Like, why are you able to say this? What evidence do you have? And I think, of course, it just goes back to some of the principles of journalism. But, you know, looking back, we didn't have the information that the officials have. And I'm just saying, you know, in school, just letting people know that sometimes even the officials won't be 100% truthful with you, okay? They won't be 100% truthful, and it's your job to sort of get at the truth, find ways to challenge, you know, the truth that is being presented to you. Another thing I think they should always know is, you know, like, don't be afraid to push, you know, with objectivity. A lot of the times, you know, we're sort of taught, okay, let's go with the news of the day, stories that are already out there, stories that are already in the conversation. But us, I think, let's not be afraid to push stories that are not out there. You know, I am a person of color. Is there an issue that is affecting a particular community within, a particular community, BIPOC community? Like, we have that right to bring that story to, you know, national attention, you know, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. And it might seem as if we're creating a barrier for objectivity, but that also, you know, that's also a responsibility of journalists to bring issues that are not out there, to tell stories that are not being told.
Thank you, Tamika. I'm going to go to a question now that was submitted by one of the people watching. And here's the question. As news organizations grapple with the task of making newsrooms safer spaces for BIPOC journalists, and as they work towards increasing that representation in their newsrooms, how should news organizations go about making changes so that work doesn't fall squarely on the shoulders of the BIPOC journalists that they may already have in their newsroom? Because I think that a lot of journalists who are BIPOC feel it's their responsibility to fix everything. It's their responsibility to do every single story, etc. So I'm going to start with you, Farah, on this one.
Tamika and Karyn know it's exhausting because it's, you know, when you're always the one that everyone goes to, it takes a load. It's really, really tiring, especially when something happens that affects you. I mean, we had, when the blackface scandal happened with the Trudeau government, we had Black journalists who were really upset about it, right? And having to cover it and then having to deal with that. It's not easy. So I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind. So I'm glad that question is being asked. I think it comes down to educating our other journalists. I think, we have another question saying that, isn't it bad to just get all the BIPOC journalists to kind of cover this? Is that fair to do? What about other journalists? And I think we have to encourage the other journalists to kind of pitch these stories, right? Like, we have to explain to our newsrooms that these are important stories. And that's why when I said change comes from the top, I think it's really imperative for news leaders to talk about why this is important. The other thing is, and I think for people who aren't from BIPOC communities, I think there's a fear, right? I think they're scared to say the wrong thing or use the wrong, pronoun or whatever it is, right? So I think there's this real, like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble. Twitter's going to come after me. And we did this thing at Global, and we've kind of stopped it from the pandemic, and I hope it starts again. And it's these off-the-record sessions where we brought in people from various communities, and we've asked the uncomfortable questions that we really want to know and don't have an answer to. And it's completely off the record. And it's been helpful for some journalists to really understand. Now, having said that, you know how the news day works, that everybody's able to attend those, right? But I think we have to figure out ways to really educate our newsrooms in covering these stories better and really articulating why these stories are important. And I'm not saying a quota or anything like that, but I think we need to really look deep at our newscasts and see who's covering the stories, and see how many stories are in the lineup on any given day, and really seek to kind of change that.
I'm going to go over to you, Karyn, on this. How do you think newsrooms should go about doing this? And I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Farah said. I really think that the notion of fear you mentioned is very real. And I think that there's a great fear of Twitter, to be frank. Twitter can sometimes be a very unkind place. So how should we go about doing this, Karyn?
Well, I think there's a flip side to this. I mean, I talk to a lot of BIPOC journalists who push and push and push, and they say the story is important. You're not covering the angle in a way that I think it should be covered. And they hit a wall and they get frustrated and they leave. At times, I don't know how many times Native women are referred to as difficult. I have it right, speaking of Twitter, in my Twitter description. I am a difficult Indigenous woman because I've been called that all my life. But just for doing the same job that I think any other reporter, even a white male reporter, would do, where I'm fighting for my stories. There has to be, if you're going to talk about creating a safe space, you kind of have to open your ears and realize that as as a gatekeeper, as a story editor, as a producer, when somebody comes to you and says, there should be a different angle on the story, I don't feel like the wording is correct. I'm pitching a story and I've pitched it over and over again, and I'm telling you it's an important story to the community that I come from. You have to listen to that. And you cannot think that that person pushing you is difficult. I mean, that's the thing that I really don't get is there is a bias there where journalists of color are labeled as difficult when they push for these stories.
And that pushing, I think, that you're talking about is actually, it should be welcomed in a sense, because what it does is it takes us out of our, this is kind of our typical news day. These are the stories we usually do. And it pushes you out of that complacency where you think you know everything and that you've seen everything and you really haven't seen or known everything. And after several years in a newsroom or running a newsroom, you think I would say a lot of people might think that they have it down pat, right? So that notion of openness is definitely something that we have to explore and encourage in our newsrooms. Tamika, I wanted to come to you in terms of one of the things that I think is maybe lacking when it comes to relationships with various communities is we just don't have those relationships with various communities. Farah was just mentioning how we've had people come in and talk to us, educate us, open our eyes to how things are working in their communities or things that we should know when we're covering stories. So what sorts of strategies would you encourage for newsrooms to reach out to these communities? Should we be having sessions or webinars? Should newsroom directors, start building relationships? I think relationships are things that take time to build, and I think that maybe a lot of newsrooms haven't put that time in.
Yep, they certainly haven't put that time in yet. But before I go to that, I really want to touch on something that Karyn said, and she says she's labeled as difficult. So imagine being labeled or typecast as the angry Black woman, and it's sort of something that we and journalists like myself face, because when you get passionate, it's like I feel like sometimes our colleagues are able to get more passionate in a story. They're even allowed to get angry and raise their voice a little bit. However, when it's coming from myself or even some of my other journalists are like, whoa, they feel, suddenly it goes up a little bit, they might feel just a bit threatened when we're allowed to be passionate just as much as everyone else is. And I think when I think of some of my colleagues who I have this discussion with, I feel like whenever it sort of plays on our psyche in the sense that you always have to be toning your voice down just a little bit. You always have to make sure that you're a bit more calm than your colleagues. And it's almost as if your passion isn't exactly welcome. So Karyn, I totally get what you're feeling, okay? But yes, back to the question, Beatrice, talking about how do we get into these communities? I think it's communities realizing that we genuinely care. That is the problem. A lot of the times they're like, oh, you're just trying to come to us to feel good and pat yourselves on the back that you're actually covering something about the community. It takes time for them to see how genuine you are as a media organization, that you're coming to them because you really and truly care what's happening in their community. And no, this is not just for a pat on your back to make the organization look good. It's just that you want to know what's happening. And I think ways to do this, and I do see it happening, is really, through our social media. The community is on social media. That's where you find a lot of them. And I think, it's having webinars, it's encouraging them to send in questions. having emails set up that they can reach newsrooms, or, get their viewpoint across, so that they do not feel isolated, so that they do feel as if their stories matter, as if their voices matter. And I think, engaging them in ways such as, creating like a competition, so that they can showcase their art, so that they can showcase their writing, those types of things. That's what I hear in terms of, the feedback that I'm getting from my community.
Beatrice, can I just jump in on something that you said a little bit earlier, and it has to do with social media. You mentioned that there's this real fear about Twitter, right? There's a fear for white journalists, of course, about Twitter, but imagine what journalists of color have been going through on Twitter and go through every single day, the vitriol, right? So for journalists who are not from BIPOC communities worried about kind of a Twitter backlash or tirade, I mean, you just look at us, we go through it all the time. I think that's something that you need to kind of, again, look at the other perspective before it's made into an excuse.
For sure. I think that everyone is a little bit afraid of Twitter, to be frank. It's definitely sometimes a very unkind place. I wanted to ask this question as well. I'll start with you, Karyn. Are there systemic stories or stories that we're still collectively missing in the mainstream media?
Yes. I mean, if you're watching, and I don't know actually how many people actually sit down and watch national newscast anymore. I think we all get our news in bits, but if you actually did, you could look at how many stories are actually stories that include people of color, or Tamika had mentioned earlier, are coming from the community. Very often I find that we get brought into stories when it's, okay, well, there's an American election. I wonder if Indigenous people think anything about that. But the actual stories that are happening at the core in the community that are something that they care more about don't necessarily get covered. I think also there is that level of story that needs to be told that sometimes is not going to get as many clicks or as many eyeballs. I think sometimes news has to be a little bit about eating your broccoli. And I feel like there's been a lot of pressure on the news industry to do stories that are going to get the most hits or the most clicks. And it concerns me because I feel like those stories are playing to, the large population. Like they can always outclick us. They can always outclick a smaller minority community. So I think that's something that I've just been watching take place, and it concerns me.
That's a good point. What do you think, Tamika?
I agree with Karyn. I think, like, if I'm thinking about it from my perspective, stories that I think we're missing, or when we're talking about systemic racism, I think coming out of the reckoning that we had last year, like I saw like an increase of people of color being appointed to positions, higher level positions, management, and it's all, and it's sort of, and while I welcome it, but like things that I'm hearing is that it almost felt like tokenism, it almost felt a bit like tokenism. Like, are these people being appointed these positions because they deserve it and because they're qualified, or is it because they're having BIPOC, they're having such a year of reckoning, and we really have to do more. Let's put this one person here. Let's put this other one person here. Let's put that person there. And I think we haven't really challenged these organizations, to be more accountable. Like, ask them, why is this happening and why now? And that's sort of a story that I would like to hear more of. Why is it happening? Not that you're upset that it's happening, but why now? Why wasn't it happening before? And is there a commitment in terms of, do you guys have programs in place that will now hire more diverse people into being leaders? If there's a program, let us know about it. Does the public know about it?
And I just want to jump in and add something to what Tamika said, because I think she's right on the money. I would only add that if, you know, this hiring is going on, I've wondered the same thing. Are you just hiring and saying, oh, good, we've got one? You know, are you really going to let that person make the changes they need to the newsroom to get at the heart of the issue and the heart of the bias that they're finding at the newsroom and open it up? You have to give them that power, not just hire them and then expect them to behave the way anybody else would behave and go back to business as usual.
And
And
are
then
they
just-
properly supported? And are they properly supported, right?
Indeed.
And if
Yeah.
they're the only one in a meeting, right? That's BIPOC, right? Somebody who is, you know, is in a newsroom with, you know, that's very white, and they're the only BIPOC, described it to me, saying that, you know, it feels like they have a folding chair, like they have a seat at the table, but it's a folding chair, you know, and it's hard to voice your opinion and your pitch when you're surrounded by people who have a very different life experience than you. So I think those people have to understand and give that person kind of, you know, deeper listening, right? Give them that when they're making a pitch or having an opinion.
One of the things too, just to pick up on your point, Tamika, yes, the appointments are happening now, so to speak, or have happened in a bit of a cluster. My thinking is, you know, is this sort of, are people going to continue to hire in the future? Or is it just a cluster that's happening now in response to what's been going on in society, right? Is this a commitment that's going to actually go into the future? Or is it just something that people are doing now because they feel pressure, to be frank, to do that? Here's another question from somebody watching. Is there a risk of overstepping when covering a community that you're not part of? I'm going to start with you, Farah, on this one.
You know, it's funny. I saw that question come in, and I thought about it a little bit. I don't know. I don't think so. I think that there are ways to cover stories. So maybe when you're covering a story and you're concerned about how it's written, or the words you've used, or how you've covered it, I think there is some due diligence. You know, you can talk to people who are community advocates or who are in that community to try to understand. And like I said, I'm okay with it most of the time. If somebody was to come to me and say, you know, how does this sound, or I want to run this by you, but I know not everybody is in newsrooms. So I think there's that. But the other part of it is, I shouldn't just be outraged about something that is, you know, because I'm Muslim and because I'm a woman and because I'm a woman of color. For a white guy to also be upset about it, that's good. That's what it should be. You know, we should see it all together. We should see things like hate and misogyny and discrimination as un-Canadian. Like, we should see that as a problem, right? So when, you know, I've had people who are like, well, I don't know if I should be covering that story as a white guy, or, you know, and to me, it's like, why not? Why shouldn't you be covering that story as a white guy? Of course you should be covering it, you know? So to me, I don't know if you're really overstepping. I think there is due diligence that you'd have to do that maybe someone else wouldn't have to do. But to me, I don't see that as overstepping.
Tamika, what do you think?
I agree with Farah. I don't see it as overstepping. I think, you know, it's pulling out from the community. Like if it's something that you're not a part of that community, it's about pulling those voices in, ensuring that you're getting all the aspects and, you know, that the issues that they're facing and all the angles that they want to get out there, and not so much what you want to get out there. It's their truth. And I think, you know, if they see how genuine you are to want to get at the truth and want to get their perspectives out, you know, then it's almost like a win-win for them. Then they will feel more comfortable to give you the information that you need. And so they won't necessarily feel like, okay, you're coming in with a fakeness. You know what I mean? No one wants that.
Mm-hmm. Karyn.
I think, again, I think it can be useful to bring another perspective in. I agree with everything that was said so far about due diligence. I think that there's good media criticism out there that you can learn from. And I think Farah raised a good point about also connecting with somebody who's sort of like got some expertise in the community if you want to chat. What I wanted to add was that one of the news directors early on at APTN was actually not Indigenous. It was Rita Deverell, who is a Black woman who grew up in segregated Texas. So she knew a lot about systemic racism, but coming in to run an Indigenous newsroom was working outside her community. And by the way, I've had to do that too, because I haven't always worked in Indigenous news. But when she came in, one of the questions that she asked, there had been one of those outbreaks of suicides that sometimes happen in remote communities. And she asked, why is it happening? And we kind of looked at her and said, well, Rita, because the kids are poor, because there's a lack of hope. And she said, yes, but I come from a community where that's true too. And we don't experience this. So what is it? And we totally had to rethink, you know, like our perspective on this and question how we've been covering it and the kind of questions that we've been asking. So there's some very useful outside perspectives that you can bring in when you're knowledgeable, but you're also from the outside. I think that that can be very helpful. Diversity is always good.
That's great. It's one has to always think, any member of any community has to re-examine their own perception of what objectivity means, because your own perceptions might be clouding something, as you've just pointed out, Karyn. There may be something that each one of us is missing because of the thought patterns we already have in our heads. I wanted to address a very immediate contemporary issue that we and our panelists were talking about just before we went live, and it had to do with, you know, the ongoing cuts in our business. We do know that in the last couple of days there have been massive cuts at Bell Media. I believe they're ongoing, and this is not something new to our business, unfortunately. I've been in the business for 20 years. I've seen many cuts at all different kinds of places over the years. But let's talk about the notion of those cuts, of shrinking newsrooms, fewer people, and how that affects our ability to tell the kinds of stories we've been talking about in this webinar. So I'm going to start with Tamika on this one. How do you feel that cuts, fewer people, affect the kinds of stories that we're trying to get out there and the notion of objectivity?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's pretty tough because I mean, already with shrinking resources, shrinking budgets, it's already a lot just to be able to get, you know, like the regular stories out there, just to be able to function and operate on a daily basis. So can you imagine that even decreasing even more? You might just end up with like one person of color in a newsroom, right? And so if there's one person of color in a newsroom, maybe you don't even have a person, like their immediate supervisor or management above them might not necessarily be BIPOC. And I think then that affects story selection. You know, that would affect story selection. If you have a project that you have to pitch, you have to pitch, say it's something about Black profiles, and you know it's important for Black History Month, or, you know, say in another month. And if you aren't able to get everyone in that room to buy into the importance of the story or the importance of this feature that you want to pitch, then, you know, your supervisor or the person above you, they aren't gonna like greenlight it. And if those things aren't getting greenlighted, then what it means is that eventually the output of stories that matter to the different communities and diverse communities, they won't be getting that range. And if they aren't getting that range, they're going to say they aren't seeing the representation that they should be seeing in the stories that are out there. And they're going to eventually and ultimately feel that their voices don't matter, that they don't matter. And I think we don't want that. So that I can see that being a hugely challenging situation. And I feel like if that's the case, newsrooms will have to be very strategic and intentional about how it is that they're going to address that.
Thank you, Tamika. Farah, you had a few points before we started as well on this. Please expand on that.
First, I mean, my heart goes out to all these amazing journalists who we've heard of. I mean, I've been there. It is so difficult, and but there is light at the end of the tunnel because there's so many ways to make content now, right? Unlike 10, 20 years ago, there are ways to make, you know, your own show, your own content. So I hope some people are able to kind of do that. I think that the one thing I guess that comes right out to me is, you know, having these journalists who have to, you know, file for web, radio, TV now, do it all. It's really difficult to get to the bottom of issues. I mean, it becomes like Nescafe journalism, like instant journalism, right? Where we're not kind of digging deep. We're just really getting to the surface. And these days, I mean, there's so much nuance in every story, right? And if you're not following it, people will call you out, and not just on Twitter, people will call you out for not telling the story in the right way. And we owe it to our audiences. And it's great that our audiences are more aware and are more vocal about how things are covered. So I think there is really a big, concern about what's happening right now and what's happening to the state of journalism. And I hope people realize that, if they're not paying for the product, then they are the product, and they do pay for journalism, and they do pay for good news and reporting. But what I think is something that actually my kid's grade 2 teacher said to him just downstairs while he's virtual learning, and it was, do your best work, don't do your fastest work, right? So when I apply that to what we're doing, I think sometimes there's just a rush to get stories out. And with less people, maybe it just means we need to spend a little more time on these stories, and we have to give our reporters a little bit of leeway and not worry that, someone else has it first or whatever. We just do the best story possible. And again, as you mentioned, let's be honest, TV news ratings are not what it used to be. And a lot of people are getting their information online, from the web, from streaming services. So I think in this world, it's okay to have, a better story, right, than a story we would have put out just like that, and kind of avoid this Nescafe journalism that I mentioned.
I really like that term Nescafe. I'm going to use it in the future. It's really good. In the role that I have, one of the things that I do is try to ensure that stories have a multi-platform rollout, so that if a story originates in our online team, that we're trying to put something together for television, that we are trying to prepare some content for radio. And it's a lot. And a lot of the time, all of that work, that content creation, falls on one person or two people. So that is anybody who's filed a TV story on a daily deadline knows how much work that is, and knows how much work it is to write 2 or 3 online stories, and knows how much work it is to do a number of radio hits. So we may be in a situation where in our wanting to get our good products out on as many platforms as possible, we may need to make some actual choices about how much we're going to create on the stories that we have. And I want to sort of pivot to Karyn on this, because you're in a position where you're teaching people about journalism. And I assume, and maybe this is the incorrect assumption, that journalists now are not learning simply one technique like it was when I was in journalism. I specialized in broadcast, but they're probably trained to be multi-platform, to sort of expect this level of demand on them.
Yeah, they're trained in print, they're trained in podcast / radio documentary. A lot of them, I'm teaching class now where people are doing a lot of online platforms. We bring in a lot of people who have done startups. When we're talking about diversity in the legacy media, it's not very diverse. 2 of my colleagues, Asma Malik and Sonia Fatah, did an analysis of columnists and showed that the proportion of racialized columnists is actually decreasing, while the population of Canada, the diversity in Canada, is increasing. And so we don't have great numbers on the industry itself, because people don't release those numbers. But both the CAJ and those 2 professors separately are working on projects to try to collect statistics, right? While legacy media is facing issues, a lot of it has been made of print and advertising revenues leaving and things shrinking. There's also the same issue in broadcast. The advertising dollars are leaving, but people are cutting cable. And so cable subscriber fees, which the broadcast industry depends on quite a bit to operate, are also shrinking. And now you've got these new businesses opening up, but are they going to be any more diverse? So you've got the issues of, yes, doing multiple things and maybe needing to take a deeper dive into stories. APTN was a very small newsroom, 65 people, including the technical staff, less than $7 million to operate on, daily half-hour news show, investigative show once a week, and 4 other talk shows, and that's who produced it, and that was the budget for everything. Salaries, cars, gas, airplanes, closed captioning, fiber feeds. So it was a very tiny, small budget. And our investigative show, it was hilarious when they get nominated for awards. They go up against CBC and they list 12 people that worked on the CBC piece. And then the APTN reporter would get nominated as like, video by Trina Roach, written by Trina Roach, investigated by Trina Roach, produced by, it's one person who's putting together a full 22-minute investigation. So there's always, and then I guess, there's the fear, like AP10 is not immune to what the rest of the industry is going into. What if it fails? Then where is that voice going to be? So there is a real crisis that we're looking at while we're trying to fix the legacy media. And we're dealing with all these issues of less resources, less people, layoffs, and an industry that wasn't diverse in the first place. What's new and what's coming up may not be any better. And so I think, at least in teaching, what I'm trying to do is encouraging people to go out and maybe do their own startups and fill in those spaces that have never been filled.
Thank you. If you can believe it, almost an hour has gone by. So I'm going to come to each of you in this wide-ranging discussion for some closing notes from each of you. I'm going to start with Tamika. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but what are your closing thoughts on this discussion today?
I think my closing thoughts is, like, I really appreciate us tackling objectivity and realizing that there needs to be room in all of this for lived experience and recognizing that our own experiences do matter. But I think one of the things I want to close off with for me, and while I'm talking about lived experiences, why this is important to me. So I just want to go back to that tragedy with George Floyd. I remember the day it happened, and me being asked to write a story for this. And let me tell you, after viewing that video, I can't even find words to tell you the state that I was in. And for me, I'm talking not just to BIPOC colleagues, I'm talking to the wider newsroom, everyone that's in this newsroom, asking that we really need to be a bit more kinder to each other. We really need to be plugged in about, what your colleague next to you, who happens to be BIPOC, is facing, when something happens. How does that affect them? Being open to giving them the space or the time that they need to deal with this. Even just reaching out to say, oh my gosh, this is such a terrible story. How are you feeling right now? What's going through your mind? I think, yes, we have our stories to get out there in the midst of the daily grind and deadlines and everything. But sometimes you really just have to take a moment to pause, to be human. And I think when we do this, it will benefit not just BIPOC colleagues, but the whole newsroom at large. And that's sort of my parting words of wisdom today.
Thank you, Tamika. Over to you, Karyn.
Well, as I've been being difficult, I want to thank everybody for being passionate alongside me. I'm going to say something difficult, and then I'm going to say something hopeful. One of the things that struck me when the Black Lives Matter movement sort of opened up in Canada is the way it relates for Indigenous people, and that was hopeful. The hard part about it, or the difficult thing that I need to say, is that we did have a 1996 commission that raised these issues about Indigenous people in the media. Then we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that raised these issues about the media. Then we had a national inquiry on missing women that raised these issues about the media. And there was often pushback, or there was often nods, but people moved along and not much happened. When the Black Lives Matter movement started up earlier this year, they created space for Indigenous people. And for the first time, we sort of got momentum going. And I'm grateful but sad in a way that had to happen, or that's the way it had to happen. I'm grateful that of the room made for us so we could be part of the conversation. But why, after all that effort, was the conversation not opened up before? That's a question I think that the industry has to ask itself. But what I can say is that I'm grateful that they're listening now. The conversation that we're having today, the things I'm saying, I know are not always easy or pleasant to hear, but I know people are listening. And that is a place that I 20 years ago, I didn't think that I could have an open conversation like this without people throwing stones at me. So I'm grateful, and I hope it makes a difference. I hope that we can all think about things, learn together, and make the industry more diverse.
Thank you, Karyn. And over to you, Farah.
Okay, I'll be quick because I realize we're out of time, but I'll just say really quick things because I know we have a lot of news leaders on this call. So what I would like to say to them is be a don't know it all. Be curious, ask questions, and don't be defensive. Don't think that your employees are personally attacking you. Don't think things so personally. Know that you don't know everything about different communities, about BIPOC communities. We've done things a certain way for so long. And really try to be curious and open yourselves up and listen. And again, it's so easy to put that wall up and say, well, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. But you know, our employees, BIPOC employees, especially Black and Indigenous employees, have been really putting themselves out there to try to make people understand their perspective and their lived experience. What we've been going through in newsrooms, in news editorial meetings for years, right, is now brought to the surface. It's now time for you as news leaders to listen, to understand, and to be don't know it alls, because you don't know it all about what it's like to live in those shoes. So I want to just leave with that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm being
so
difficult, I
much.
know.
No, not at all. Actually, I think these are all words that everybody needs to hear. The thing about journalism is, I know I got into it because it fed my brain. It allowed me to learn something new every day. And I can tell you, when I was a reporter running around Toronto on crazy deadlines, even if I didn't like the story I was doing, the one thing that kept me going was that I was learning something every day. And I think we really need to expand that notion of learning. It's not just about stories and about what we do, but remembering that we don't know everything about people, we don't know everything about what's going on, et cetera. So absolutely great advice from everybody. Great closing comments. I want to throw it over to Fiona now to help us end our very first inaugural webinar.
Thank you. A lot of learning and a lot of curiosity for everyone to take away. So I appreciate everybody's contribution today. We're going to have more of these, and I hope that if you have any ideas, you'll let us know what you would like to hear. And I'd like to also remind you that the RTDNA awards season is open, and please submit for your awards, and we will be having a conference later in the spring. So once again, thank you all for contributing, and we really appreciate the honesty and the openness that from all of our panelists. So, and great job, Beatrice.
Thank you. And just a reminder to anybody who's still, I can see 32 participants, I think, are still logged on. If there are any webinars that you would like for us to do, any questions you want explored, any people you want to hear from, please go ahead and put those topics in the Q&A. We will track them. And just to let you know, so here are a few things that we're considering. The stress in terms of working from home for journalists, especially those who are looking after their kids and probably doing Zoom interviews on Saturdays and at 10 o'clock at night and all the rest of it. Trauma among journalists, which is something that we brought up on this call, as well as Gen Z. What does the news look like to that generation? So we'd love to hear from you. So let us know, comment in the Q&A, or send your suggestions to events@rtdnacanada.com. And with that, thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to those who have attended. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I look forward to many more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.